Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this very important conversation. We'd like to give special acknowledgement for the many parents, advocates, staff, and workers in prevention services, and special recognition for the Assembly and staff at the Senate. Very much appreciate you being here. This forum is about reimagining child welfare, strengthening New York families, and promoting pandemic recovery. I'm Dr. Sophine Charles, the Associate Executive Director downstate at the Council of Family and Child Caring Agencies, also known as COFCCA. We represent more than 100 not-for-profit child welfare agencies providing foster care, adoption, prevention services, juvenile justice programs, and specialized educational services across the state of New York. Our member agencies and staff deliver critical and essential services to tens of thousands of children and families. We partnered with the Citizens Committee for Children of New York to survey prevention services providers regarding their work during the pandemic. The Citizens Committee for Children of New York, also known as CCC, is a 75-year-old independent multi-issue child advocacy organization. CCC does not accept or receive public resources, provide direct services, nor represent a sector or a workforce. CCC documents the facts, engage and mobilize New Yorkers and advocates for solutions to ensure that every New York child is healthy, educated, and safe. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated disparities faced by families and children across New York State and frontline prevention services providers who have been working to address drastically heightened economic, housing, behavioral health, and childcare needs over the course of the last 2 years. As we look ahead in 2022, the time is now to call attention to action that state and local leaders must take to strengthen families and help children thrive. During this conversation, CCC and COFCCA will showcase statewide findings of child welfare prevention agencies, including the top needs that children and families presented, and will highlight the challenges providers face during the first year of the pandemic. This will be followed by an overview of policy and budget priorities that must be enacted to advance an equitable pandemic recovery. We're happy to be joined by guest speaker, Assemblyman Andrew Hevesi, who will highlight the opportunity to improve child and family well-being by passing the Children and Families Reinvestment Act. And I'd also like you to know that part of our panel, we have Jack Mullen. Jack is the research associate at Citizens Committee for Children of New York. And we also have, as mentioned, Assemblyman Andrew Hevesi, our New York State champion for child welfare and children's services. And with us, we have Caitlin Pazzaretti, policy and advocacy associate at the Children's Committee for Children of New York. And now I'd like to turn this discussion over to Assemblyman Hevesi so he can frame the advocacy work that we have ahead of us.
Dr. Charles, thank you so much. And good afternoon to all of my friends. This is an important Zoom, and I'm honored to be here. And so first, let me start by thanking the Citizens Committee for Children, all of my friends there, and COFCCA for all of your work. You guys are amazing and invaluable in the policy discussions that we've had and are going to continue to have, but also to the workforce. And let me address, and Dr. Charles mentioned this, to the parents and the advocates and the staff and the workers. My messaging is to you, and I'm going to be as genuine as I can be and do something politically that's not smart, which is raise expectations. So this is our year. This has to be our year. And I'm not saying that as another politician, just, hey, this is our year, come on, let's go do good stuff. I have a different perspective. So I've been around for a while. I've been in the Assembly for 17 years and was privileged. I'm now privileged to serve as Children and Families Chair, and prior as Social Services Chair. When I was Social Services Chair, we did work in this space. So I have witnessed what you have experienced, and I've only seen it, you've lived it, which is an administration over the last 12 years that was openly hostile to your workforce, openly hostile to the kids. And I'm not saying this to beat up on the former governor, he's irrelevant, but the policies were very, very bad and dangerous. So I can name now for the past 5 years, executive budget proposals from our governor that would have stripped money from the most vulnerable children. I can rattle them off year by year by year. And part of the reason that was done is to keep us off our feet, keep us on the defensive, so we don't make progress. So we're playing all these years defense, and we played a lot of defense, and we stopped some of the governor's proposals. Some of them got through. Like 3 years ago, he got $60 million from foster care for no reason, no financial reason, but that's what we've been dealing with. And now on top of that, when we were trying in the legislature to make progress, everything we tried to do, the answer is no. Automatic no. We want to give money for this. No. We want to help them. No, 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 no. And that was the reality we lived with and you lived with. And I'm here to tell you, and this is going to raise expectations, but that is gone. That block, that animosity, that automatic no is not a part of our lives anymore. Now survey the field. That's all I'm doing here. That you're going to have our friends go into exactly what is needed and why it's needed on a substantive level. But from a political level, if you're doing strategy and you're surveying the field, you have allies in every corner now. And you have an excited legislature with powerful, powerful members, many of them new, many of them who know ACEs, and many of them who are learning child welfare, and they are engaged. And that's why we were going to be aggressive if the last administration was around. Doesn't matter, we were going to push over him anyway because he was weak last year, but now we have an even better shot. So here's where we're going. The Children and Families Reinvestment Act, and I'm going to stop soon because I know I only have a couple of minutes. But the Children, sorry guys, but the Children and Families Reinvestment Act, that's what we're going for. Now there's several pieces to it. I'm only going to focus on one today because it's the one I care about the most. Now there's 3 pieces to the Children and Families Act. There's a new flexible fund to get money into communities. I'm very excited about that. And I love childcare. I do. But that's not where my heart is. My heart is the 65-35. That's my number one. If anybody's going to ask publicly or privately where the Assembly and where I'm going to leave my colleagues in the legislature to go to first in child welfare, it is the restoration of the 65-35 county split, which we've been operating at 62-38, which has taken money from counties, it has taken money from kids, and it has made sure that that great program, by the way, that program, I believe, is one of the prime factors for the drop in the foster care numbers over the last decades. And the fact that we haven't been funding it is so remarkably stupid, I can't stand it. And then you go down the list. What's next for preventative services? How about KinGAP? Well, KinGAP is exactly where you want us to go as a state because you want kids not in foster care or congregate foster care. You want them in kinship homes, right? Well, right now it's in a block grant that is capped. So what does that mean? That means you can't grow. So you got to get kinship out of there so we can grow, so we can get people with families. And I'm very excited about that because I had the honor of being part of writing the law to expand kinship to not just blood marriage or adoption. And then we should go down the list even further. The child welfare housing subsidy. I'm gonna end with this and tell you a little bit of a story that tells you how we had to deal with the last administration and where we are now. We originally had a bill in the Assembly and the legislature several years ago that did 2 things. It raised that child welfare housing subsidy because we know that those kids and those families need that help under those circumstances to get out of foster care or to help them once they're involved in the systems. So we put in a bill that raised it to $600 a month. The monthly rent is $600 a month, and we were going to allow those kids to live with roommates. But it's the bad administration So their automatic is no. They said no, and they killed it, and they stopped us one year. So the next year we adjusted. So what we did was we passed the bill to allow those kids to live with roommates. That is a law, and I am thrilled that that's a law now, because we gave some kids an opportunity to live with roommates. But we're coming back now, and now we don't just want the $600. Now we've raised it for inflation. We want $725 for those kids, because we know how important these things are for our families. And let me just end with this, because I'm riled now. Maybe I shouldn't have had that coffee. But let me end with this. The days of remarkably stupid government, and I know I don't want anybody to be offended by that, but it's stupid government when you are doing two things in the child welfare space. If your policies are hurting children and families and they're wasting taxpayers' money, that's stupid policy. The reverse is smart policy saves us money, and smart policy saves those families and helps those families and kids. That's what we're going for. Let's get New York State back into the business of preventing problems when they occur, which is at the child welfare system. I've rambled too long. Thank you, everybody. We're going to have a good year, but we need all of you to have a good weekend. Come back to us on Monday, and let's go fight for the next 3 months to make sure that we get what we deserve for our workforce, for our kids and our families. Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman Hevesi. We like raised expectations, because we know when the expectations are raised, we are moving toward progress. And so COFCCA partnered with the Citizens Committee for Children of New York to survey the impact of the pandemic and the impact on families. We wanted to capture the experiences of families doing the prevention services as our providers were delivering prevention services. And we heard the stories from Sunset Park in Brooklyn, the young mother coming home with the newborn from the shelter, only to go to the shelter without any supplies, food, clothing, diapers, formula, anything for the child. And our service providers were the one to meet those needs. And that's just one example. We wanted to capture what was going on. And Jacqueline is going to provide the results of our survey and our, Jack.
Thanks so much, Sophine. And thanks to all who are joining us today. So Sophine gave a really great overview of this project and who COFCCA and CCC are, and why we decided to join forces in 2020 and into 2021 to really develop a survey to hear from providers who are in this position to really uniquely report on the experiences of families during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how providers themselves have had to navigate and carry out programs both under existing contracts and under the emerging challenges that came under the pandemic too. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to go through this project and what we learned from the survey that we reached both locally in New York City and across the state. And so over 2020 to 2021, we ended up running a survey from February 2021. We heard from more than 350 providers in New York City in staff and leadership positions at city agencies. And then we worked with a very committed and diligent group of providers across the state to redesign this questionnaire for the statewide context in collaboration with these providers across the state. And in that case, we heard from 120 respondents from around early July to August 2021. So in the following slides, as I said, I'll be sharing findings from both the state and the city surveys to really illustrate the findings that resonated both across both contexts in upstate and downstate providers, as well as a few differences between the two and how they really reinforce what Assemblymember Hevesi was saying up front too. So to give you a sense first off of who we heard from and who participated in these surveys, in both the state and the city samples, we heard primarily from agency case planners, from supervisors, from program directors, as well as those in senior management roles, as well as some in administrative or quality assurance positions. We asked this question up front to really gather a sense of who is participating based on the role, and you'll see later it helps us refine some of these findings based on participants' familiarity with certain staffing or financial decisions in their program or in their agency. In the city, as I said, we heard from 350 providers in all the 5 boroughs. And then across the state, we reached providers in all the remaining 57 counties outside of New York City. You'll see that participation concentrated around urban areas like the Capital District, like Buffalo, like Syracuse. And we also heard from providers who serve some clients in New York City. So you'll see there's participation in the Bronx and Brooklyn, Queens, even if someone is based in Long Island or Westchester, for example. So I want to start here with what the agency staff reported to us about the experiences of families and providers over 2020 and 2021, as the responses really underscore how families' basic needs have been challenged and heightened really over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. In each survey, we asked providers whether over the past year they felt families' needs for certain services increased, decreased, or remained the same. So starting across the New York State survey, we see a very large share of providers, more than 80%, who reported that families' need for internet access, including devices, during the pandemic increased. This is followed by, again, close to 80% reporting increased needs for household items such as sanitizer and disinfectants, children's education and childcare, as well as more than 70% reporting a need for mental health counseling and food. You'll see other areas that were reported on where providers noted an increased need was related to domestic violence counseling, government services such as SNAP or Social Security insurance benefits, health counseling, and housing and food as well. We asked the same question in New York City of providers across the city and found strikingly similar results. In fact, in New York City, we find the same 5 issues from the statewide results, where the highest share of providers again reported an increase in needs. These are internet access and devices, food, education and childcare for children, household items, and mental health counseling for adults and or children. So that's more than 70% of providers across the city, again, reporting an increase in these needs among families over the course of the pandemic. So in addition to measuring providers' perception of families' needs over the pandemic, then we also asked them directly about their own needs in their programs and agencies over this time. In New York State specifically, across the state, we asked respondents whether the need for additional funding to supplement their contracted amounts was increasing, decreasing, or remain the same over the past year. And this finding here is specifically among program directors, executive directors, senior management, as they were less likely to say that they didn't know an answer to this question. So those who are more familiar with this, more than 50% reported an increased need for funding over the past 12 months. So some of the qualitative responses we saw that complement this finding as well suggested that, while families have these heightened needs, such as the need for cash assistance and housing support, they can actually be addressed under existing contracts, and that's why they need this supplemental funding that would be critical for that. Another question we posed to providers across the state was whether their counties had eliminated or reduced any prevention contracts with their agency over the past 12 months. And we see nearly 40% of respondents across the state reporting that yes, they did not. They did report that their county lost or reduced their contracts to work in prevention. We see across regions in the southern tier and in central New York regions, around 50% of providers working in these areas reported a loss or reduction in prevention contracts over the last year. Again, in the open-ended responses that accompanied this question, we heard from providers who said that they just weren't able to grow their programs or had to cancel or close their programs entirely due to funding constraints. And this is obviously a very troubling finding in the context of, over the same time, we see these increased needs being reported among families and for providers to be able to carry out their work through the pandemic. So now the following section will cover a few findings related to the nature and the conditions of prevention work during the pandemic, which really point to providers working creatively to meet families where they are, while still facing these persistent challenges with sustaining and supporting the workforce. So in the world of COVID-19 that we're still in, obviously the public health restrictions that accompany this period, we asked providers, we wanted to know how are their agencies and their clients' preferences evolving in the midst of communication during the pandemic. Do they still have a preference for in-person visits, phone calls, virtual conferencing, or a combination of all three? And across the state, providers report that both program staff and clients prefer a combination of the in-person visits, the phone calls, and virtual conferencing. This held true in the citywide survey as well. And again, a qualitative data that we collected underscored the benefits of this flexible communication strategy and how in some cases families and providers felt more comfortable doing teleconferencing rather than arranging in-person visits over this time. In terms of staffing and personnel, a significant share of providers upstate reported a decrease in both the applicant pool and the number of employees on staff over the last 12 months. In the statewide survey, we see 53% of respondents reported a decrease in qualified applicants for open positions, and 46% reported that there was a decrease in the number of employees on staff. This is a notable difference from the citywide sample, where we see a relatively smaller share of providers who reported decreased staffing and hiring capacity over the time. And then again, over the state, over the same period, state providers report an increase in the responsibilities and time being put into their work. So if they see increased needs among families, but decreased capacity to hire and staff their programs, that comes with a lot of added responsibilities and decreased capacity to balance their workload. So, we see a high share of staff, 61% across the state reported an increased need to take on responsibilities outside their usual domain to support fellow staff in meeting families' needs. Nearly 40% of providers also reporting that the number of clients and travel hours has increased over the last year. Meanwhile, we see a significant share of providers reporting greater difficulties in balancing job commitments. 23% reported a decreased capacity to fit their work hours with family or social commitments outside of work. Their work-life balance has suffered. And then 17% report that their capacity to balance casework and training requirements has also decreased. Finally, I'm going to close out here with just a couple of findings that point to providers' views on the workforce and funding challenges. These come from a series of questions that were on an agree to disagree scale that we posed to those participating in the survey, both city and statewide. So these items are areas really where there was a higher degree of disagreement among respondents in the survey. And I'm going to be highlighting here a few that are specific to workforce and funding challenges. So taking it from the bottom of this slide, the statement, my agency has the funding needed to provide appropriate transportation options for staff traveling to and from face-to-face meetings. Across the statewide survey, 33% of providers disagree on this point, that they have the funding for transportation. On whether there are enough licensed clinicians at their agency, 41% across the state disagreed. And around half of those responding say that they disagree that prevention programs are able to meet staffing requirements for evidence-based programs. And another large share disagree that their agency has the funding needed to recruit and retain staff using competitive compensation and benefits packages. And then above all, we see 57% of providers upstate report that they disagree on staff having sufficient hazard pay, obviously an issue of compensation for them being frontline workers and taking on additional health risks and carrying out their work during the pandemic. We see similar disagreements were registered among providers in the citywide survey too. So this time starting from the top again, we can point to a significant share disagreeing on the point of hazard pay. We also see challenges in funding for internet and transportation needs for communication and meeting with clients. So pointing to these sentences or these points highlighted here, 29% disagree that they have the funding needed to provide appropriate internet access and devices. And 29% also disagree that they have the transportation options, again, for carrying out face-to-face meetings with clients. And further, 1 in 4 disagree that citywide providers have that ACS training specifically adequately prepared them to address the heightened needs that have arisen for families in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this concludes a brief summary of the findings from CCC and COFCCA surveys of prevention service providers. With that, I'm going to pass the Zoom mic over to my colleague, Caitlin Passaretti, Policy Associate at CCC.
Thank you so much, Jack. And thank you again, everyone who is joining us today. So earlier, Assemblymember Hevesi spoke about his vision, and to synthesize, our conversation today is focusing on championing a 3-pillar proposal advanced by Assemblymember Hevesi in his office and supported by the data that Jack just shared with you. First, we want primary prevention. We need intentional investments in primary prevention so counties have the flexibility to provide support to youth and families in a way that averts contact with the child welfare system altogether. We must fund and support community-driven approaches and assets, address trauma and hardship, and ensure equitable service access outside of the child welfare system. Second, we need universal childcare. A universal childcare system must be available in all communities and focused on supporting the social, emotional, and developmental needs of all young children. Not only will this support the child, but also provide parents with a needed resource, allowing them to look for sustained employment or to pursue educational opportunities. Third, we want the providers to have the resources to meet family needs and provide tangible support. This budget season, we can reauthorize and strengthen the child welfare financing statute that Assembly members spoke about earlier by securing full funding and a restoration of the state and local 65-35 match for prevention. We can also do this by pulling the funding for the Kinship Guardian program out of the foster care block grant and ensuring that KinGAP subsidies mirror adoption subsidies and thus allow for a more permanent option. And by raising the value of the child welfare housing subsidy to promote family reunification and independent living. Finally, as Jack showed, the data clearly shows that the child welfare workforce needs more support. This workforce has been on the front lines of New York's pandemic response, and we strongly support investing in a stable, well-trained workforce by increasing base salaries for staff and providing annual cost of living adjustments. We hope you join us in organizing for these goals in the upcoming months, and we'll now shift to answering some of the questions that you have placed in our question and answer function. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. For delivering the policy priorities and ask. We are taking the questions that are appearing in the Q&A section. The first question that we received is, will reimagining and reinventing include differential response and signs of safety and child protection for all of New York? Having it in just a handful of districts, the disparity is great there. And I'm going to turn that over to Assemblyman Hevesi, but I just want to make sure that we define what differential response is. And that's a practice that encourages community agencies to help support families that are considered low risk and allowing our child protective specialists to focus on the more serious cases in which there's child abuse and neglect, and that's been confirmed. Any thoughts about that, Assemblyman Hevesi?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to do me a favor. I lost track of the first two things you want to include. Differential response is interesting because I've heard about that in another context, and I don't mind talking about that context right here. I think you guys will appreciate it. So we're setting up differential response programs right now because Governor Hochul last month, to her credit, passed a bill into law that no longer allows children under 12 years old to be arrested or prosecuted in New York State for any reason except a homicide. The goal of that bill was to end the school to prison pipeline. Because of that bill, and it was signed just before the new year, the state has 1 year from now to implement a differential response program. So I just want to make sure, is that what we're talking about, or is there something different that the questioner had in mind?
So differential response in child welfare is related to how the CPS staff handle the cases of families that are confirmed with neglect. Okay, so there is, go ahead.
That's a great, thank you for clarifying, I appreciate it. So the answer is no. There's going to have to be some very complicated questions about the functioning of the system itself. We've already had a child welfare hearing to that end, but the policy decisions in that particular arena are so dangerous on every front. I mean, you're dealing with childhood trauma, you're dealing with families in stress and undergoing traumatic experiences, and then the government's response is traumatic. So we got to be very careful about that. So we're going to slow this down. So the answer is no, we're not going to be making policy moves in this budget. It's too short of a truncated time. We got to be more thoughtful about that.
Thank you for that response. Sure. The next question we have is related to training, and I'm looking, so I'm being blocked. I can't see the full question. What about training to deal with implicit racial bias for CPS workers as well as provider workers? And Caitlin, would you?
Actually, can I take that? Sorry, Caitlin, is that okay? Or did you?
Yeah, go. You go for it.
Sorry. Okay. Because in this past budget, we wrote this past budget this year, already done. We wrote in a law that requires implicit bias training to every mandated reporter in New York State, all of them. That will be implemented. It's coming in the next couple of years. So Caitlin, please, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem at all. Yes, I also just want to add on to that. We know that child welfare has a deep racial and class implications. And so that's why we also want to focus on primary prevention to avoid, to try to avoid contact with the child welfare system to begin with. And if that contact happens, then hopefully the trainings will supplement a more holistic response.
Great, thank you. Another question is, 36% of New Yorkers are immigrants. 7.5% of children are foreign born, yet there's no reference to services for immigrant families. Assemblyman, would you like to take that one?
Sure. I have throughout my career and will continue to always fight for children in the United States, whether they are citizens or whether they are immigrants. It was a tactical decision not to put it in the document. Did it on purpose.
How will the reinvestment of 65-35 be addressed in light of the Family First Act?
Is that for me? Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Caitlin's like, yeah, it's all you, dude. Okay. Okay. So a couple things. So with federal Families First, one of the things that's in the Children and Families Reinvestment Act, sorry about the acronym, we got to use CFRA. So in CFRA is the second goal of CFRA is to create a new flexible funding stream to get money into communities. Part of the logic behind that was because we recognize on the state level that the federal government stepped up to help by giving money to prevention, and we were really grateful to them for that. However, I think they did it in a way that is making a vast majority of our programs in New York State, preventative programs, ineligible for that funding because they require them to be evidence-based and go through a clearinghouse. And as a result, I think we're not drawing down on enough federal money. So part of the one plank of the Children and Families Reinvestment Act is to, while we're funding new programs in communities, we document them, make them evidence-based so that they can then draw down on federal Families First money. I think I said that correct. Thank you.
That's pretty good. You're very well versed in Family First Prevention Services Act. Thank you for that.
Doctor, I got to get this out. Nerds are cool, man. I'm just saying. Nerds are cool. I don't care what anybody says. So.
Nerds rule the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly.
Will there be any screening for intellectual and developmental disabilities and or learning challenges for youth 12 and under being treated as children and not juvenile delinquents? We know that all too often there's a large number of children with IDDs who end up in the school to prison pipeline. Any thoughts about that?
Yes. May I, Caitlin?
Yes, please.
I feel rude. Jack, sorry. Do you want to take that one, Jack? No, you're good. Okay. The answer is we don't have a handle in New York State on how many kids with developmental or intellectual disabilities are in any of our systems. We don't track it. So you're absolutely right. We are drafting a bill that we will be moving this year, and I'm happy to share with anybody once we get it in, but it'll take another couple weeks, I believe. That is a reporting bill to isolate and track down exactly what we're dealing with in these systems to see for the next following year what aggressive push we can go to help those kids, because it has become abundantly clear that we are not helping those kids in these systems. And then they get pushed out at 18 to other systems that are not caring for them or not focused on their behavior. And I believe that's part of what you're seeing in society when you see terrible actions by people who were just not treated and not helped when we could have. So you're seeing that all over society. But one of the pieces is, let's start by understanding exactly what we're dealing with. So there will be a bill this year, the Assembly will move to track down the number of kids in our systems that have both IDD and DD circumstances.
Well, Assemblyman, it looks like you're the star of this Q&A segment here. Thank you very much. You're so well versed. Somebody call my wife and
tell her. So,
so another question directed to you, and Caitlin and Jack, please let me know if you would like to chime in on these answers. But I think that we're deferring to the Assemblyman in this case. This question, how would primary prevention investments be decided on by communities under the bill, and what would be the oversight agency for this spending?
Great question. So for the child preventative services piece, I had envisioned, and I'm open to conversation, but I had envisioned we're just flushing money into an underfunded system. I hadn't been looking to change how the funding streams go in. The logic of that first group of asks, which we're going to go for and get this year, was that you have a system that was historically underfunded, and I'm talking about for decades, never really done well, and then intentionally hurt over the last decade. So now you have a circumstance where, you know what, first thing, let's just get some money into those systems, and we can deal with if we're doing it better after we get those systems more healthy. So we're not doing a policy or changing how we do it. We're just putting money into existing systems and existing funding streams for now. We can have those conversations perhaps next year.
Thank you for that. We have a kinship care question. Will kinship care as a growing method prevent the foster care entry? Is the legislative looking to increase investments in kin gap and kinship supports in this budget?
Caitlin, that's you, right?
Yes, thank you. Great question. So right now the goal is to take the kinship guardianship assistance program outside of the foster care block grant and leave foster care as it is and separately fund the kinship program on its own. The ask is an expensive ask. However, we know that it will have long-term benefits and is very worthy to have children stay with people that they know. And so we're really hopeful that this budget ask can happen, and then we can further legislative ask about how to keep children as close to their safety net as possible.
Thank you, Caitlin. And this is a question for one of my CCC colleagues, and it's regarding, does OCFS reference immigrant families in its Family First plan? Can you address the issue of who's planning for immigrant families and children?
Maybe Caitlin can take the aspect of whether it's referred to in OCFS plan. I can say in our survey specifically, we did actually make an effort to address immigrant families' needs, whether that's undocumented families, specifically interpretation, translation services, legal services, and of course, many of the top services and needs that were at that list that I mentioned before: internet access, food, mental health counseling. While those apply to many families, of course, they also apply to immigrant families too. And so while I didn't include that in the full list of services and needs that have been perceived by providers when we surveyed them over the last year, there were many providers, 20 to 30%, who said that in both the city and the state that they reported increased needs for undocumented families, specifically and increased needs in interpretation and language services as well.
Great, thanks. One of the questions is related to how the system will develop certain performance metrics to really gauge the impact of interventions in the system. Who would like to respond to that?
Dr. Charles, can I take that? Sure.
Sure.
Okay, so it's a great question. The answer is, first, we know these programs work. So I just want to be clear from the outset. These are existing programs, particularly 6535. I mean, if you follow the history, I read a report a while back that a report that CCC gave me a while back that indicated clearly that 6535 was responsible for the number of kids dropping in foster care. So we know those kids work. However, you're absolutely correct that there's a lot of money at play here, and we do need to keep an eye on performance, and we're not wasting taxpayer money, and we're doing this correctly. So we are considering, among a variety of other things for this budget, a way to track and monitor the progress of these particular programs. In the past, we've considered stuff like hiring a nonprofit who does those kind of evaluations as an additional add-on for whatever program we put in place. So it's on our radar, but we also, I want to come back to, we know these programs work. That's why we're investing in them.
Okay, Bijan, would you like to add to that question?
No, not at the time. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. And Caitlin, would you provide a description of the 65-35?
Yes, so back in 2008, prior to the first recession, the New York State did fund 65-35. So local providers would pay 35 and the state would compensate for 65. So it basically allowed for service providers to have like a larger reach, and the state had their back. The recession happened, that was put on pause. It went to 62-38, even though the law still says it should be 65-35. And so that is why it is, I think, a big point for CCC, COFCCA, and Assemblymember Hevesi is that this is in the law already, and we really should be at it right now.
Thank you. There's a workforce question regarding how can we best support the workforce, the child welfare workforce, who are underpaid and who have been essential workers all throughout the pandemic. And I think we provided a description in how we would like, in our ask as to how we would like to see the child welfare workforce supported. Would you like to add to that, Caitlin?
I think the question, oh yes, so we really just want to make sure that staff have the resources that they need. We saw in the data from Jack that transportation wasn't met, being able to meet families where they are wasn't met. And we know a lot of child welfare workers are really trying to put families first and like accommodate their needs. We're in a massive pandemic that is not over and doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon. And so making sure that there's cost of living adjustments every year. We can just look at how much milk costs on the shelf right now. It's just a lot needs to change in order to make sure that employees feel supported and also feel like they are doing all they can to support families.
And I think we have an incredible champion in our corner in Assemblyman Hevesi, and what he's actually doing to drive policy around addressing the child welfare workforce and getting them compensated, adequately compensated. Would you like to say any more about that, Assemblyman Hevesi?
Yeah, I absolutely would. And I really appreciate you teeing me up for this. It's an outrage how we've been treating the workforce that has been taking care of the most vulnerable kids and the kids with the most difficult problems for decades. It's outrageous. It's one of the many outrages over the last couple of years, and one that we're looking to rectify, because we understand in the legislature, particularly in the Assembly, and I'm sure my Senate colleagues too, but I want to be careful here. But I know the Assembly Democratic majority my colleagues understand how difficult the work is that you're doing, how important it is for not only those kids and families, but for society, and how absolutely outrageous it has been that when we've been trying to move to raise salaries and benefits and do other things for the workforce, including maybe, I got to reread the CFRA, but I think there's career paths in there and other ways to advance and make this a real career where you can, raise your family and take care of your family and your needs. It's been an outrage that has been happening for the last 10 years, but this is the Get Right year. And I want to put this into context. The executive budget came out from Governor Hochul with a huge amount of money for workforce, huge amount of money. And I respect the workforce in healthcare, and they deserve it. And I totally get that. And I'm going to be supportive of that. However, there are other workforces here. And you'll notice what we are fighting for, particularly in the children and family space, are the workforce for preventative services, the workforce for our foster care agencies, and the workforce for childcare. Undervalued, ignored, let me just say undervalued and leave it there. I could keep going, but it's been terrible how these workforces have been treated, and it's wrong, and everybody understands it now. And now we're going to go push for it. And I just want to end with this. When I say we, the proposal that we put before you, we released already with 36% of each of the Democratic conferences. That means 36% of the Assembly Democratic majority on board as supporters and 36% of the Senate Democratic majority on board already. And we're still building. And part of the reason is we all understand how important the workforce is, and we're going to do our best to address that this year.
Great, thank you. There's a question regarding how the system handles anonymous allegations of child abuse.
Yep. Is that me? That's me. Is that okay? Sorry.
Go for it.
Okay. So I am a sponsor of a bill on anonymous reporting. We are working through it. It's very complicated. I don't want to get into the details of it, but this is a top priority. But I am of the opinion that anything in the child welfare space where you are making decisions that are automatically going to affect what happens with these kids' lives, whether they're separated, we're going to go slow. And we're going to take it slow, and we're going to get everybody's input. But the anonymous reporting is high on my priority list, but I don't want that to give the impression that we're moving on it quick. We got to be careful about that one. But yes, we understand. And sorry, I should have led with this. People's lives are being ruined because people call into the system anonymously, and their cases are automatically required to be investigated by law. And it's a way of harassing and destroying lives and separating families by malicious actors who don't have any responsibility for it. So yeah, we're going after it, but not as quickly. I'm going to slow it down a little bit. So thank you.
Great. So I am seeing the question related to the exodus from child welfare casework across the state and county is causing a real crisis in local districts. Not enough staff to respond really and impact families and children. How might we address that immediate need? And one comment that I'll make about this is that all of our child welfare service providers and the agencies, we are losing staff going over to many of our government agencies, whether it's DOE or some of the mental health agencies in the state. And I really think that the agencies should be compensated for staff development and all of the development that we place in our staff, and then they are siphoned off because they're going to better compensation benefit packages, and that's really creating a crisis. Who would like to respond to that?
Caitlin, guys, is that okay? Sorry, because Doctor, this is too good. You're 100% right. And I would argue that it's even more than you just outlined, because it affects the child care workforce as well. And we actually, as a state, contributed to that problem last year by doing the right thing and putting more money into universal pre-K, which set up a system by which more compensation and benefits were available to people who move over to the pre-K system, which has driven an exodus out of the family childcare system. So we have to be more cognizant of how we train people and then let them go into other systems, leaving the original system bare as only training grounds and not staffed and resourced the way we want to. So we really got to rethink the way we're not only paying our friends in the workforce in various sectors, but also how they interact and where the career paths are, so we can strategically make sure that all of the systems are staffed appropriately.
And there's also the larger issue of parity regarding front and center. City and state workforce compared to contracts of the nonprofit workforce. We know that our service providers on the nonprofit front are getting a fraction of compensation and salaries compared with our government workforce.
I'll just add, yeah, I mean, this is not a battle that was exclusive to the area of child welfare too, where we, CCC in its history also had to battle for the compensation for childcare providers in their contracts with the city too. And, in this broader conversation, what the data really suggests and what, this conversation is getting at too, is just this, we have to stop the threat of this vicious cycle happening where we see contracts being reduced or eliminated in certain counties, particularly across rural counties in New York State, in the same places where they're also reporting a decrease in the number of qualified applicants, in the same places where they're reporting that they're losing staff. And if the funding isn't there, and if the staffing isn't there, it's going to continue to lead to this spiral where the capacity isn't there to provide the services that families need.
Thank you. Assemblyman Hevesi, how can people support the Children and Families Reinvestment Act and making sure it passes this year?
So do what I do and do anything that Jennifer March or Kathleen Brady-Stepien tells you to do. No, but you listen to CCC, listen to COFCCA. They are part of a team of advocates that we have put together, who are professionals. They're the brains that are putting this policy together. And we are now shifting out of the policy crafting mode into straight up, let's go get support mode. So you'll be seeing a big push in the next week or two to go get, I told you we had 36% approximately of both of the Democratic conferences of both houses. We need to get that number way up. We've amended the CFRA a little bit. We're going to be releasing that soon to add something, actually, Dr. Charles, that you mentioned, which is the interaction between workforce development in childcare and how it hits pre-K. So we've added that. And the answer is, we need all of your help to go get every one of my colleagues, and I'm not kidding, everyone. And if there's a colleague of mine in the Senate or Assembly who doesn't approve of this or has a problem with this, please come back to us and tell us, and I will go talk to them and try to figure out what we're dealing with. But there is no reason why we shouldn't be getting a huge number of colleagues on for this. And I will be honest with you, it's actually a necessity because this ask is an address. We're trying to address a system that has been broken for years. The only way you do that is with a wave of support. So please help us go get our colleagues. We're going to need all of their muscle and yours as well to get this done.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I'll take this last question, and that is, New York City family courts have recently lost several judges to Supreme Court. What attention is being paid to the courts in terms of achieving overall goals? And we know how the courts impact the movement of our families and our children getting into permanent family settings. Any comments on that, Assemblyman Hevesi?
Sure. Okay, let me start here. I have great respect for the family court system and our family court judges. And I know that there are issues with the family courts that impact children and families, but I am not an expert on them. I don't know enough about them to speak intelligently, so I'm going to defer, but that's something we could look to in the future. And also, I want to be perfectly honest, that's not my area of expertise or trying to be expertise. I'm in the Children and Families Chair. That's a question for the chairman and my friend of the Judiciary Committee, Assemblyman Chuck Levine, and I don't want to step into an area that I'm not comfortable stepping into.
Thank you. And I will just comment in terms of all the work that we do in prevention services and in child welfare, and any of the asks that we have regarding addressing workforce parity, regarding all of the issues that have been outlined in this discussion. The overall goal is to ensure that families and children get their needs met. And that's what our prevention services workers do day in and day out. And the pandemic highlighted the magnitude of their contributions to families. And we thank them and appreciate them for all their work. And we certainly highlight and recognize and acknowledge Assemblyman Hevesi for all of the work that you're doing to champion the causes of the workforce and also the children and families across the state. And Caitlin and Jack, any closing thoughts?
Thank you so much, Dr. Sophine, for moderating this. I really appreciate all of the work that you did. And thank you to all the people who are at the webinar today. I'm very grateful and really looking forward to how we can ensure an equitable child welfare system.
Yeah, echoing that, thank you to Caitlin, thank you to Dr. Charles, thank you to Assemblymember Hevesi, and thanks to all who joined us today. And I hope you continue to join us in this fight going forward.
Thank you. We cherish our partnership with the Citizens Committee for Children. We are an excellent team, and I look forward to continuing the work. Thank you all for your contributions to this forum, and until next time, thank you.